their theology was really all answered by Machen back in the days of theological liberalism. There weren't any new arguments. And the same is true of the most liberal theologians today. People think they're innovating. They think they're coming up with new stuff, but it really just goes back.
I have the Bible, and the Holy Spirit will teach me what I need to know. And as a response to that, Spurgeon said this: I find it odd that those who think so highly of what the Holy Spirit teaches them think so little of what the Holy Spirit teaches others.
Why do you think it is important for the church in the 21st century to study church history?
That's a great question, Brian. And I think it's because, well, I'll quote Spurgeon. You know, Spurgeon was talking about pastors and the need for pastors to use commentaries in their study. And he'd bump into pastors who would say, well, I don't need commentaries. I have the Holy Spirit. I have the Bible. And the Holy Spirit will teach me what I need to know. And as a response to that, Spurgeon said this: I find it odd that those who think so highly of what the Holy Spirit teaches them think so little of what the Holy Spirit teaches others. And what Spurgeon is saying there is that the Holy Spirit is not a unique gift to you or to your moment in time. The Holy Spirit has been the gift to the church since its beginning. And it has been through the ministry of the triune God in the lives of God's people that the church has been built. And we can look over the past 2 millennia and see example after example of God's faithfulness through his people. And I think that's a huge encouragement to us today. We need to be encouraged. I don't know what your situation exactly there is in the Philippines, but we're experiencing a bit of a culture shift here in the United States. And there's a growing hostility to the gospel and a growing conflict with true Christian convictions on the one hand and cultural preferences and even cultural institutions on the other hand. And what we need as Christians is to be encouraged to not only know what we believe, but to be encouraged to defend what we believe and have not just beliefs, but have convictions and have courage for those convictions. So I find in church history just example after example of God's faithfulness to his church. And I think that's a real encouragement to us. We want to be faithful disciples of Jesus Christ. That's what we all want to be. We want to get to the end of our lives and hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And so I have the Bible, I have my church, I have my Christian friends, and I have all of church history to come alongside and help me be a faithful disciple.
Okay, so do you have any specific era in church history that you love the most or that you like the most? And why do you love it the most? Can you share it with us tonight?
Great
question. Specific time in
Absolutely.
Church history.
It's the name of our college, Reformation. So this is the era I go back to, the Reformation. This was a time where you had the doctrine, so I'll use a car analogy. It's like all pistons in the engine were firing. You had the doctrine emphasis in the Reformation. You had the writing of hymns and the restoration of worship back to the church and a lively, passionate worship of a holy God. You have a missions emphasis in the Reformation. Do you know that in the 1550s, Calvin's church at Geneva sent missionaries all the way to Brazil, the shores of Brazil, in the 1550s? So you have a missions emphasis. And you have an emphasis on educating the next generation, of nurturing them and the things of the Lord, of handing down that precious tradition of the true gospel and making sure they know it and making sure they have it and putting emphasis on that. So when I look at what the reformers were doing, I just say, Lord, you did it 500 years ago. You can do it again. And we need that kind of reformation. Really, every generation needs that kind of reformation. So that's my go-to period, back to Luther, back to Calvin, even back to people like John Bunyan, the Baptist.
The writer of the Pilgrim's Progress. Yes, that's true.
I think church history is an absolute key to understanding the present and the future of Christianity. So one of the beautiful things about being in Toronto, very multicultural church, and then of course traveling the world, very multicultural view of the Christian faith. What we all have to understand is that when you become a Christian, the history of Christianity becomes your history, right? So it's not just a history of this group of people. It's like if you get adopted into a family, that family's history is your history now, right? You get the name and you get the history. as believers, that's exactly where we're at. We've inherited, we're joined into this stream that started 2,000 years ago and may continue for another 2,000 for all we know. And we've entered into this thing, and we're responsible to know it. I think there's so many key things we can understand from history, so much we can understand about the present, so much we can understand about the future if we'll look to the past, and so much we'll miss, so much we'll get wrong if we don't look to the past. So I like to use the example of the emerging church when that came along. If you remember that, back around 2000 or so. At that time, church growth was sort of, people were getting tired of the huger, bigger, big box kind of Christianity, and I think that's why a lot of people ended up in the Reform stream, but a lot also ended up in the emerging stream. And it was fascinating to me that their theology was really all answered by Machen back in the days of theological liberalism. There weren't any new arguments. And the same is true of the most liberal theologians today. People think they're innovating, they think they're coming up with new stuff, but it really just goes back. So we don't have to grapple with these things as much as we just point back and say, yes, this person's already addressed that. All these things have been said. You're turning away from the inerrancy of scriptures. You're turning away from penal substitutionary atonement. We don't have to sit down and figure this out. We can just look back and say, that's been answered and answered very well. There's so many things that, there's so much encouragement to be had to go back and find some of the people even finding their artifacts. You know, there's over in Belfast, getting Amy Carmichael's Bible out of the archives there and just hand you the Bible and say, flip through it, read through it. And just a real treasure. You know, here's someone who for years ministered and wrote in that Bible, and you could just read how she was interacting with the Word, how she was engaging with the Word, how the Lord was speaking to her through the Word, how it was ministering to her in her high points and low points. It was just tremendously encouraging to look back, to find that, and to realize that whatever we're going through today, somebody's gone through in the past, both theologically and then just very much in the nitty-gritty of life. So I found it a huge, huge blessing and encouragement.